We have defined the vision, what we're working towards, what the end result will be. And now the last guiding piece of this foundational work for the work that you're doing is core values.
So core values, it's another one of those things that just sounds so corporate, right? Like if you've worked for a company before, chances are if they're a company, they have core values. They probably told you during orientation what they are. They're probably in some workbook somewhere. They might be painted on the wall of your office or on some poster somewhere. Like core values are a thing in the world. And we have a tendency when we want to do our own thing or do a kingdom thing for God, we tend to back away. Well, if corporate America does that, I don't want to do that. Which, hey, is a fine line of thinking. Like God, Jesus's work in God's kingdom is often upside down from the way the world does things. But there's so much wisdom in the world that people have found that is there because God plants that wisdom to be found in the world. And having a core value core values is one of those things. And again, it's in the Bible, so we got to take a look at it. Let me read Acts 2:42, and the context here is, this is after Jesus left earth. He left his apostles, and he ascended to heaven. And his apostles are like, okay, now what? And then the Holy Spirit came, filled them up. They had boldness and they preached, and God added thousands and thousands of people to their number overnight, and kept happening for weeks and months on end. So that now there's thousands of believers who are calling themselves Christians, and they're getting together and forming the first church. And so that church really was a special time in the history of Christianity when they were getting together and they were just doing life together, trying to be more like Jesus. And here we pick it up in Acts 2:42, and it says, all the believers devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to sharing in meals and to prayer. That outlines the core values of this first church, this first group of believers. And we can develop our core values based on what is the makeup of their core values.
The core values being the things that they have decided they value no matter what. The things that drive the core of who they are, the core of what they're doing. They are going to value these things no matter what.
And the reason this is important is because this will inform who you do life with, who you do business with, what decisions you make, and what decisions you don't make. There are going to be people who might want to pay you money to do something, but if they're not the kind of person that lines up with your core values, maybe you have to make the hard decision to say, I'm sorry, I'm not the person to take your money in this case, because it's not a core values match. Certainly the case when it comes time to consider who to add to your team. The core values help you identify who is not only running the same race I'm running, but they're running the same direction I'm running, and generally the same speed that I'm running. It's helping identify people that you can easily link up arms with and do life and business together. And provides a compass for yourself to make sure that the decisions you make line up with these core values. If it ever kind of grates against one of your core values, then maybe it's not the right decision, or it's not the right product to make or right service to offer, because there's a clash there.
Because here's one thing that's super true. As you dive deeper and deeper into this kingdom work, as you commit your life and the time that you spend here on earth to building God's kingdom, you have a very real enemy who is dedicated wholeheartedly to derail you from that, to stop you from doing that. And opportunities will come your way that are going to sound really good, or that are going to be really tempting, that if you take them, they're going to take you directly off route from the direction that God called you to go. Having a mission statement, knowing exactly who you're serving and how you're doing it, having a vision, knowing where you're going, and having core values guiding what you value most are going to be the things that are going to keep you headed in the right direction, regardless of what distractions the enemy comes at you with. It's not always going to be an attack from the enemy, is not always illness or poverty or something bad in the way.
It could be a great opportunity.
The enemy can attack with great opportunities. Like Mike said, the enemy can attack by someone wanting to pay you a whole bunch of money, and that sounds really, really good. But if that is not aligned with your core values, if it is not aligned with the vision, the direction you're going, if it is not working within the mission that you have, then that could just be a distraction from the enemy to keep you off track, to stop the work and derail the work that you're called to do. So that's the level of importance that this is. This is not just a corporate thing. This is not just something to fill out our business plan with. It is incredibly important for the church in Acts, for the first church in Acts. They knew that they needed to dedicate themselves to teaching, to fellowship, to sharing in meals, and to prayer. And if they let go of those things, they were not going to survive as the early church. And that is what we're talking about. It is that important. So dig into this with us. Mike, what's the first thing we can learn from this Acts church?
I want to share one more thing before we get into what it looked like for this church and what it means for you, is when we're talking about these values, they need to be core to who you are, not who you want to be. Because if you define some core values based on your aspirations of how you want to see yourself or how you want to be seen, then you're not going to actually be consistent with it. These are not goals. These are not wishes or dreams. These are values that are currently true of you and based on how you operate. The first church here, they were getting together. They got together, they listened to the teaching, like that's what they did. And so that was core to who they are. And if you try to define some core values based on what you hope to be or like what you want to be true of you, then there's going to be inconsistencies. You're going to miss the mark. There's going to be confusion. And as people are looking at you and looking at your core values, they're going to see a disconnect there, and there's a lack of trust. And then you're going to be wandering aimlessly, trying to make decisions based on something that isn't even core to who you are. So in Acts 2:42, it looked like the first one, the apostles' teaching, was the first core value of the early church. What that represents here is, how are you challenged to grow? That's how the first church was challenged to grow. They would listen and take in the apostles' teaching, those who knew God and were commissioned by Jesus himself to go and teach people. They sat under their teaching. They were challenged to grow by the things the apostles taught, and that was important to them. What is important to you in terms of how are you challenged to grow? It could be teaching and could be the Bible. It doesn't have to be so churchy sounding. Just what challenges you to grow? What motivates you to keep growing and overcoming? That's the first thing to think about. List some things here in this worksheet to consider any possible core values here. By the way, we're not pressuring you to like, this is your core value. If you list it here, that's not the case. Just answer the questions as things come to mind. And
of what's true.
Of just what's true of you now in terms of these things. So how do you get challenged to grow? That's the first thing. The second thing to ask yourself is, what makes you feel connected and unified with others? Again, for this first church, it was, well, they called it fellowship, right? And so what does fellowship look like to you and your work? And when you feel connected to people, what does that look like to you? What does that feel like to you? What situations is that true in your life? And just lists whatever comes to mind when you think of fellowship and connecting with others here. And then the third category of core values that we can draw from Acts 2.
Because sharing meals is next, which
yes.
sounds to me like fellowship.
Yes.
Like in the churches I grew up with, fellowship time was mealtime.
Yes.
So it sounds like the same thing, but it's not.
Right.
It actually illuminates another area that we can investigate within our lives.
More specific than just getting together is meals, especially in that culture, represented well, part of their culture, and it was a rhythm and it's a tradition. We eat meals, hopefully, about 3 times a day. It's a part of our rhythms. We even may have some weekly meal like Taco Tuesday or something like that. Or in our family, we're not every week with it, but I know growing up, and we've done this often with our family here, is like Saturday dinner was always just popcorn and like some muffins and something in the microwave like a pizza rolls or something like that, bagel bites, or I don't know, something like that.
Super healthy.
And so, yeah, I'm not saying it was healthy, but it was tradition. And so these meals, sharing in meals, represents these rhythms, these traditions, this, you might call it a culture. You don't have to have a company to have a culture. You can just, this is just kind of how it feels as you go about doing what you do.
I like Waffle Wednesday.
Waffle Wednesday.
Breakfast for dinner on Wednesdays.
That's good. So the Lord's Supper is what this first church observed. And the first supper is itself a symbolic, rhythmic tradition that Jesus wanted his people to continue to observe. Mm-hmm. So what rhythms, what traditions are important to you that really is kind of core to who you are and how you go about your work? If anything comes to mind there, list that here in the worksheet. And then, finally, how do you get filled up? For the early church, they devoted themselves to prayer. And how do you get filled up? Now, prayer, of course, is important. It should be a regular discipline. And it's a great way to connect to God, but it's not the only way. It's a great way to get filled up with what you need, but it's not the only way that shows itself. Maybe prayer is an actual core value that you're going to list as a core value. That's great. But expanding that to think of, how do you get filled up? What just fills you up and recharges your batteries? And it's like, oh yeah, that's what I need to rest. That's what I need to find peace. Yes, it comes from God, but how does it show itself in your life in some more specific areas?
What are those things? And again, as we're looking at the core values, it's what you already do. It's what you already value. So we're asking these questions. It's what challenges you to, what do you do to get challenged to grow? How do you unify with people? What are your rhythms? What fills you up? It's those things that if we said all of a sudden you can't do that anymore, you'd be like, ooh, not acceptable. I'm gonna keep doing it. Mm-hmm. You can't stop me from doing this. This is core to who I am. This is core to how I live my life. This is core to how I want this business to function. This is a non-negotiable value because I value this thing too much to let it go.
And I'm going to challenge you to try to be unique to you in this. Mm-hmm. And because what is true about the Acts 2 church is that those core values, although they aren't necessarily unique to churches nowadays when you have thousands and thousands of churches around the world, they could all have those core values and be true of them, and they should. But for them in that first church, it was very unique to that group of people. Nobody else in the city did that stuff except for these groups of believers. And so I'm going to challenge you to consider some of these core values that are just unique to you. It's like kind of your secret sauce, kind of the thing that makes you tick, and doesn't necessarily apply to anyone else, especially anyone else doing the same sort of work that you're doing. It's kind of unique to you and your kind of secret weapon, your operating system that makes you you.
So as you're going through this worksheet, take some time to answer these questions. Just brain dump on the page and just write as many ideas as you can come up with. They're not all going to be core values, but just starting to think about those things and dig into what really is core, what really is something that you value. And then go back and, Mike, what's a good number of core values?
I think a great number is between 4 to 6 or so. If it's too few, then you kind of need to triangulate, right? Like if you just have one core value, there's a lot of wiggle room around it. If you've got 2, then you can flip-flop on either side of that line. But if you have 3, then that's a good solid base to say, yeah, you can triangulate that and say, yep, that's core to who I am. If you have 4, that's even more specific. I wouldn't go more than 6. Even 6 might be pushing it a little bit, and I would encourage you to maybe specify or maybe find 2 these are kind of the same thing if I phrase it this way. It's up to you. If you go more than that, then A, it's hard to remember. And you want to remember these. If they're core, you want to be able to list them off. If you have too many, then this just might be true things about you or things you like, but it's not necessarily core values.
They can't all be core.
Kelsey worked for a company, and
they had 9 core values.
Were there 9 core values?
There were 9 core values. And I'm like, there's no possible way that all of these are core.
They're not core.
And really, while working for that company and living out my life with that company, they really held on to like 3 or 4 of them.
Yes,
those
and that's
are really
what
core. And then there were like 5 that were like, yeah, that's true most of the time, but like we let it go if it doesn't fit a situation. And so even in that, they named 9 core values, but they really only had about 4.
Yeah. And so that goes to show you too, like if you want to if I got 9 and I love them, like sit with them for a little bit and see then maybe if there are these 4 that really are true all the time.
There's some situations where I let this one go and I'm okay with that. There's nothing sinful about that.
So maybe let it go.
Maybe that's not a core value. It's a value, but maybe it's not core.
Yeah, so boil down your list to 4, 5, maybe 6, 3, no less than 3 core values that you can then use think of it as this compass, that this is going to help you determine what is taking you off path and what is true to who you are and where you're going.
And anyone who you would want to partner with, or anyone you would want to hire.
It's a filter.
Or anyone you would want to serve would also share those things. And if they don't share those things, then you're not going to likely want them serving on your board or partnering with you financially or inviting you onto their podcast. And then those things get to really drive those decisions. And that's when you get to really live in such freedom of knowing that you have clarified your mission. You know how you're moving forward. You know how you're actively moving forward in the work that God's called you to. You've clarified your vision. You know where you're headed. Everybody around you knows where you're headed. You've got the vision, the mountain in the distance that everybody knows that's where you're going. And you've got your core values that are steering you, that are keeping you solid, that are keeping you from falling to one side or the other, so that you can say yes to the things you should say yes to, no to the things that you should say no to, and you're really confident in those decisions because they either do or do not align with your core values. Now that you have that foundation
that's some good clarity.
That's some great clarity, and that is a great foundation to build the rest of the work that you're about to do.